I'd like to thank everybody for coming today to our conversation with Emily Bell on coronavirus and misinformation. I'd really like to thank Nadine El-Tamli and Amira Dalla for helping organize this and for providing tech support. And I want to say that the Technology and Media and Communication specialization at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, of which I am the director, is very proud to once again partner with Emily Bell from the Tao Center for Digital Journalism. Many of you know Emily as really one of the leading thinkers in the world on the subject of misinformation, disinformation, and platform power. And the research that the Tao Center does is really important. TMAC and the Anya Business School had planned a two-day conference on April 16th and 17th on women and social media. And Emily Bell had been our closing keynote speaker. So we're still hoping that we can have the conference on December 10th and 11th. We had dozens of panelists from all over the world presenting papers on, scheduled to present papers on women and social media, and journalists coming from a number of different countries as well. And since we couldn't do the conference live, we decided that we would organize this here on Zoom. And Emily was really kind enough to agree to come and speak to us. So I think we'll be beginning with Emily telling us what the hell is going on right now online. What is all this garbage out there, what Joan Donovan would call the weaponization of disinformation? Who's putting it out there and why are they doing it? We're really looking forward to hearing you make some sense of all of this, Emily.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Anya. Thanks everyone who's joined us, particularly on a Friday afternoon, and particularly when I'm guessing quite a few of you have spent several hours on Zoom already this week. And thanks very much indeed for inviting me to talk about this. It's very kind of Anya to say that I'm a world expert on misinformation and platform power. I'm really not. If I have any expertise at all, it's in journalism and where it fits in this world. But this year at the journalism school, I've been teaching a really fascinating course. I've been learning a lot from it with John Keegan, who's a journalist at The Markup, which is a new organization looking at some of these, if you like, the way that big technology operates in society, and producing stories on it. And we've called it the Information Warfare Reporting course. And we called it that because it occurred to us that now if you're a journalist, it doesn't matter. We used to train journalists to go out into the field in flak jackets, and we'd call it warfare reporting because there are certain things that you have to do to keep yourself safe, sane, and producing high quality stories in physical combat. And we'd noticed that just the pressure on all of our students when they graduated and went into very diverse jobs was increasing just around reporting almost any subject now which has a kind of an element of money or power in it. Really sort of requires you to be able to navigate a whole kind of layer of information which is not journalism, which is often corrupted or misinformation or disinformation or sort of things which are physically or psychologically threatening to you. So unfortunately, it is now the lot of journalists, I think, to really be sort of key players in this war. So I have to thank Anya for inviting me along because she's actually an expert in this. I'm hoping she will talk to me a little bit about it. The question about what the hell is going on out there is one that we've been asking ourselves, some of us for actually quite a long time, for the last sort of, 10, 15 years, really since the switch in control of media pathways to the public happened. And before that, I think we knew that there were all sorts of problems with corporate media. We knew that there were good journalistic practices and very bad journalistic practices. But we suddenly found ourselves in about 2010 realizing that those people who were now controlling the pathways to your phone or your screen were actually engineers who hadn't really got a background in how to think about these issues, in whether or not they wanted to be sort of editorial or curatorial, whether they were neutral technology platforms, as they really sort of described themselves until very, very recently, actually, until sort of 2017, 2018. And we knew that these changes were taking place. The American election of 2016 and the interference in it by overseas players, particularly the Russian Internet Research Agency, was for a lot of people a moment when suddenly the things that they sort of suspected had been happening, like unstewarded ways in which information or news was now sort of, you know, appearing in front of people that they didn't really understand. It was suddenly a moment of clarity that this whole world had grown up of misinformation, disinformation, which nobody really understood the pathways particularly well, least of all the companies who have been key in enabling it to be created, in making it profitable for people to do, and also for making it an actually sort of very powerful weapon when it came to helping get officials elected or organizing either sort of positive or negative campaigns about things. So really sort of the last 4 years have been transformative in the field, where journalists have had to scramble to think about what is disinformation, what's going on out there. And we thought the big test of how all of those systems were working was going to be the 2020 election, certainly from an American perspective. It's actually turned out to be coronavirus. And I think it's kind of highlighted several things on the what the hell is going on out there basis, which means that two things that I'll sort of argue and talk about today, and I really want to take people's questions on it. One of which is I think we have actually made some progress. But the other thing of which is I think we've made not nearly enough progress, and our sort of fascination and focus on misinformation may in fact be not adequate. I think we may have decided that we can sort out what's wrong with our news environment and our society, our democracy, with a series of sort of sticking plasters, whereas in fact we actually need something which is much more like a vaccination or a cure for the whole body. So on the subject of what's going on out there, this is the point at which my slides helpfully don't work. Oh, there we go. So I started off by thinking, and Anya, do chip in here, which is, so who's actually sort of propagating things which are not true, or things which sow discord or misinform? And the categories of these, and I owe a debt to people like Camille Francois at Graphica, who has talked about this sort of categorization, my former colleague Claire Wardle at First Draft, etc. People who think about sort of categorization of these things a lot. State actors, I think, are still prevalent, but we think of state actors in that, again, America. If we're thinking through a sort of an Amerocentric lens, we've always thought about Russia, China. You can add Iran to that in the coronavirus, but also, you know, the daily US presidential White House briefing on coronavirus has become a key source of contestable misinformation, telling us all sorts of things which are not based in science, ramping cures which are not cures, suggesting that actually it might be safe to stop socially distancing when the established science is that it won't be safe. So when I say state actors, I think we have to include our own sort of domestic state actors in that as well. Then there are non-state actors, commercial, which I think is where a huge amount of this is coming from. Probably about, so there are something like 120,000 domains have been set up with coronavirus, COVID-19 in the keywords since since March the 9th or 10th. So in about a month, you have 120,000 sites, some of which are well-intentioned, well-motivated, containing good information, but quite a lot of which are just making money from people's anxiety and a crisis. And it's a good time to remind ourselves that sites like InfoWars, Alex Jones's infamous sort of pantomime station on YouTube, actually made all of its money from selling vitamin supplements before it was demonetized. So there's an awful lot of money to be made in making people fear for their health and telling them that all sorts of things will boost their immune system, or that people can obtain things that really sort of won't do them any good at all. And then actually here is the sort of growing category, which I think is now dominating the news and will continue to do so, not least because actually the political cycle and the pandemic are beginning to run together very much in terms of both the news agenda and if you like, the disinformation agenda. And in that, I mean that there are sort of several very high profile conspiracy theories which serve a certain agenda. In the UK, a couple of weeks ago, for anyone who's been following this, a sort of a theory that, a conspiracy theory that 5G masks, partly because they are developed often with Chinese technology companies like Huawei, partly because their rollout has coincided with the spread of the pandemic. These have been fused into the most ridiculous conspiracy theories that the two things are in some way linked, and either you can get coronavirus from 5G masks, or that they are part of some international plot to mask some of the sort of the health damage that will be done to you by radio waves. None of this is based in science, but it became so widespread in the UK that I think in 4 different cities you had 5G masks being set fire to and vandalized. And that was a sort of an example of where things which seem to be crackpot baseless theories on the internet actually spill out into real life and start doing real harm. And you could, Bill Gates, something very interesting for people who watch misinformation is happening there at the moment, which again, you know, Bill Gates's long-term interest in vaccination is being conflated with totally sort of bizarre politicized theories about him wanting to be involved in population control, in him wanting to insert chips into the general population so that he can track people. This has been showing up in places where sort of 4 or 5 years ago it wouldn't have shown up, like Instagram has been a major platform for spreading some of those theories. You also have sort of things like the campaigns to open up states early. And you could argue, well, maybe that's not misinformation, maybe that's just a sort of a different point of view. I think it is kind of pretty much sort of, it's perpetuating the myth that there is a conspiracy among state governors, particularly progressive state governors, that somehow keeping people inside is deliberately derailing the Trump presidency, and it's curtailing people's liberties. And we've seen, again, sort of physical demonstrations, many of them armed. One took place in Michigan a couple of days ago. And then there are things like the standard, if you like, ways of attracting or hyping up things which are not true, that try and sort of, you know, attention hack the media, like the filmmyhospital hashtag, which is really a series of sort of right-wing characters encouraging people to drive past their local hospital and film it, and posting the film on social media saying, look, there are empty car parks, there are empty reception areas. I drove past my hospital 10 minutes ago, there was nobody there. All of this is made up. It's a liberal media conspiracy. It's a political plot. Actually, of course, if you've read any of the coverage in depth, most hospitals have been advised to shut down their main entrances and not have anybody in the car park. And if you go around the corner to the ER entrance, there'll be a long line of ambulances and a flood of patients. But nevertheless, this is something which has got sort of remarkable traction among a small number of people, and particularly sort of spreading on places like Twitter. And then there's a whole area which isn't really sort of, when we talk about misinformation, which arguably has actually had possibly sort of some of the bigger effects, are things which are just not settled, or where opinions change over time. And it's, if you take, for instance, the issue of whether or not to wear a mask, the Chinese government from the very sort of outset of when they admitted that there was a problem, have always advised their population to wear masks. We were advised for a certain amount of time, there's no point in having a mask. It won't do anything to protect you, and if you do have a mask, you probably won't fit it properly, etc., etc. Right up to sort of 2 days ago, where here in New York City, we were told if you go out without a mask in 2 days' time, we will fine you. Because so there are areas, I think, in controlling a pandemic where our current frameworks of misinformation don't work very well. Because quite often what you have to be able to do is get people to change their behaviors when there's an existential threat like coronavirus, with messaging, with consistent messaging, where actually the outcomes and even some of the facts aren't completely established and agreed on. And I think we've seen an awful lot of that, both from discussions of things like herd immunity, from looking at different scientific surveys which are not necessarily in agreement. Now, I don't know whether or not we should even categorize that as misinformation. My worry is that we sort of start to categorize that as misinformation. So, Anya, I'd love to hear what you think about that.
I'm very interested in this ranking, and I know I'm already getting chats from everyone saying, well, what's the solution? I know you're going to get to that soon. But I guess one thing I was just quickly was wondering, with this ranking, is that an order of importance? Or, I mean, do we have any idea? I mean, I know it's impossible to quantify because there's millions of things, but how much of this is, like my aunt, totally well-meaning, but sends me stuff all the time that's just not true, right? So you have a whole category of that, as you mentioned. Then there's agenda, conspiracy theories, crackpots, people making money. I know that Consumer Reports just did an ad about how you can still get this drink bleach advertisements up. So do you have any idea of these groups, which is the most, or do we just not know?
Well, so one of the problems that we still have, actually, which is a residual problem from sort of 2016 or 17, is that the platforms, often the platforms that contain this kind of thing, are very closed to researchers like you and me. It's actually very, very hard to define exactly where the largest problems exist. And where we do have that information, it tends to be around the things which are of most interest to government, or, well, of most interest to government. So we actually know much more now than we did about foreign actors. And we've had a lot of information coming out of Facebook and various groups like the Stanford Internet Observatory, not necessarily just focused on coronavirus, but in general, say, sort of identifying large numbers of coordinated campaigns, not just in America, but in Africa and Middle East and other places. So I think that sort of, we have a sense that that is, the most important, because it feels as though this somehow fits into a sort of a geopolitical conflict. But there's a really great article that was in Nature in October 2018 by a professor of public health called Heidi Larson that I would highly recommend. In fact, I'll post the link into chat, which asks about, talks about viral misinformation. And in it, she says, as a public health official, really the single biggest problem is just bad science. It is just people saying things like, actually, kind of, if you hold your breath, it tests whether or not you have coronavirus. There was a really neat little kind of symptom, piece of sort of symptom public health messaging that was circulated, certainly sort of by the BBC and other places in the UK, which said, if you have a dry cough and you have a fever, then you have coronavirus. If you don't have those symptoms, you probably don't have it. We now know that that's completely not true. That actually you can be asymptomatic or have a whole series of different symptoms and still have the virus. It's just that at the time when, the public health authorities really only wanted people coming to hospital who were in existential danger, those were the symptoms that were easy enough to track. And this article by Heidi Larson says that, you know, without a shadow of a doubt, the most important category of that is probably the category of people just talking about things which are not true. And when you look at consumption patterns, there's been an enormous uptick in people returning to mainstream news brands. So if you think about the big news brands at the moment, they're all experiencing traffic and attention which is higher than any other level in the past, partly because when, I guess the last thing that happened, which was even close to this, would be 9/11, connectivity was in a very different place. But really since sort of, you know, social media and traffic records begun, this is just a much, much, much bigger story than anything else. And that attention tends to now be going to official outlets. So it tends to be going to the news channels. It tends to be going to brands like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the big regional and local publishers that people sort of depend on, if you like, and unfortunately to also some other channels like Fox News, which has very much been in the field of pushing theories which are not necessarily of downplaying the crisis as a whole. So to answer your question, like, which is the biggest problem? If you look at it from a public health perspective, I think it probably is just things which are residing in that grey area of people not really understanding how the science is settled and really latching onto them. You know, the president saying, if you take so I can never say it's too long a word. If you take medicines to cure coronavirus, it will definitely work. Is an incredibly damaging. That's probably a much more serious piece of misinformation. I mean, you know, if you look at, I sort of answer a little bit of that with this, which is, you know, 2 days ago, Avaz, who are an activist organisation that have been pushing hard for platform accountability for a while, described Facebook as the epicenter of misinformation. And they have some great statistics here about how provenly false material, which has been flagged by their own fact checkers, by Facebook's own fact-checking network as not true, sort of lingers on the platform for far too long. Maybe it takes sort of up to 22 days for the company to take it down. There are lots of things which still have not been flagged on there. And this kind of research prompted Mark Zuckerberg just yesterday to say, we're now going to tell people when they have seen a piece of information which might not be right about coronavirus. And I think that this is what we think of as sort of that classic misinformation and the thing that has to be stamped out. And surely it's easy for the platform.
But then Wendy, Emily, what do you do, you know, to Wendy Morphew's point and others, which is when it's Bolsonaro or it's the president or it's Modi, right? You've got all these autocratic leaders that are now just dismissing science. So then there's that huge dilemma.
Well, again, it's so
and Facebook, is Facebook going to take them down?
Well, yes, in the case of
Bolsonaro.
So we've had a really extraordinary moment, I think, which so much has been happening that I'm not sure to what extent people have actually sort of taken notice of it who aren't in Brazil. But Bolsonaro had posts taken down by Facebook on Instagram and by Twitter on his Twitter feed, which were ridiculing the concept of social distancing and showing him, you know, in the street, shaking hands with people, practicing sort of, you know, unsafe proximity. And for the platforms to say, we are now going to take those posts down is an enormous change in the attitude that they have been showing. And it's also partial because they have acted on Bolsonaro, but they've acted partially. This tweet went up just this afternoon on the president's Twitter feed here, which is totally sort of false in suggesting that, you know, Michigan is somehow under martial law, and it backs up an open Michigan demonstration that was 2 days ago that's deliberately undermining Whitmer, the governor. It's undermining her completely sensible public health, science-backed, keep everybody, you know, keep everybody socially distanced and at home. Has Twitter taken this down? No, it hasn't. So what we've seen is this sort of realization, I think, on the platform's part, when they look at somebody like Bolsonaro. Well, here is something which is really sort of actually kind of an existential threat. We have said that we will remove false information about coronavirus. This steps into that area. We don't care that it's a leader of a country, we'll take it down. When it comes to the President of the United States, they're adopting a very different attitude, and arguably that is where some of the more, you know, important misinformation comes from. And it's I think that sort of, you know, just you know, again, sort of mention the Bolsonaro takedown on here, which is this sort of development of an editorial or curatorial sensibility within the companies. I think the problem is that they don't really have a culture of understanding how to make those decisions.
Can I just get in here somewhere, because obviously I'm seeing all the questions on the chat, and I just want to make sure we all understand what the tech companies are doing, which is they're not fact checking and putting, they are to some extent. I mean, to what extent are they just sort of suppressing and taking down? To what extent are they actually marking and upranking the good stuff, the trustworthy stuff, and to what extent are they providing counter speech in the form of interviews or different? Because I feel like we've got three things you can do, right? You can put the good stuff up, you can create new good stuff and put it up, or you can just rank and take stuff down. And there's a lot of questions on the chat from people about what exactly are they doing.
So what they're doing now, which they haven't done before, the first one is that they are coordinating between platforms. So there was no mistake. I think the fact that both Twitter and Facebook took the same view of Bolsonaro's tweets and posts is the outcome of a decision early on in this between a number of platforms, including Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, Reddit, etc., that there are certain things that they will all move on together, which has not been the case before. So that's the first thing that they are doing. They are aggressively marking and taking down material. How much they're doing that is very hard to determine, not least because they don't even really tell their own third-party fact-checking network how much stuff has been deleted. So we do occasionally get, you know, sort of posts, or we're told that there have been, you know, X thousand pages or accounts removed, which for instance have been trying to sell masks. So that was something that happened early on, which was, you know, we had Facebook saying we're not going to allow anybody to advertise masks on our platform. Don't know what they're going to do now that we all actually have to buy a mask. And the second thing that they've been doing is the up-ranking question. Every platform now has a flag when you search for coronavirus, or even when you're looking at coronavirus type stories, which leads you to official information. I mean, that in itself is actually quite a kind of controversial thing now, because, you know, the question is, do you point to the CDC or do you point to the World Health Organization? Do you point to both? Do you think that the official information on this is adequate? Do you want to supplement it with, you know, more critical, diverse voices from the press? If you look at sort of what Facebook have done, they've created a coronavirus center, information center with resources on it. They haven't integrated, as it were, sort of trustworthy news sources into that yet, which I'm a bit disappointed by, because apart from anything else, official sources don't update in real time. So people will go off and look for things elsewhere. The news tabs that all of these companies have introduced are tightening all of their editorial standards. So if you start with Google News, actually even before the pandemic, they had said that they would be narrowing the number of outlets that they would be promoting on Google News. They've made a big effort, I think, to get rid of rogue search queries, which might throw up misleading headlines. Facebook has introduced something called a news tab, which is the first time it's actually curated news organizations into that tab. The problem with that is that it's only available to a certain number of accounts in the States, and it's not really possibly sort of, it is still perhaps too algorithmically ranked and not edited enough because it has a small team on it. You have.
And do they, sorry, question from the audience, do they make a distinction when they're deciding what to control between, Russian disinformation or Chinese disinformation versus something on Fox, for example, or do they just look and see whether it makes no sense, I guess?
Well, so I think that this is my point really about Bolsonaro and Trump, which is that they have to make these contextualized decisions, and the closer it is to home, and by home I mean really the regulatory system within the United States, then the more those decisions are going to kind of flex in favor of the platform's business interests here, and less in favor of having an absolute, if you like, sort of set of rules that they stick to in a very sort of regimented way. So to some extent, you could say it's a bit of a mess. I think that what I think it's a sign of is this, which is the platforms really resisted this idea that they should be developing a more editorial culture within their companies. And they resisted that even beyond 2017, 2018. What I understand from the platforms is that coronavirus, if you like, has sort of pushed aside some of the arguments about we should be neutral, we should treat everything the same, and has actually just forced their hand to be much, much more interventionist. Because they are aware that if they get this wrong, then lives will be lost as a result. It feels, I think it had initially felt easier for the platforms because nobody is advocating for the coronavirus. It doesn't have a lobby, it doesn't have a big ad spend, it's not trying to kind of, buy its way into our society. However, I think as the coronavirus stories and misinformation become fused with the political cycle, which is now happening, that is going to really challenge them, because they have said explicitly, particularly in America, that they won't moderate, for instance, political advertising, or that they won't. Now where you get misinformation about coronavirus in a political advertisement, then it will be an interesting test of will they override, political speech in order to so if you get disagreements about or misrepresentations about social distancing on a partisan lines. And there was a study out today actually which said that Republicans are much less likely to have worn a mask in public in the last 5 days than Democrats are. When those two stories become fused, then I think the platform policies are going to be really, really, really tested. And the truth is that even though they've made some progress since 2016, they have not made nearly enough to be able to consistently deal with some of these problems. And some of the, they're also under a certain amount of, they're extremely wealthy companies, but their ability to really make those nuanced calls or to articulate policy is hampered by coronavirus. They've had to send all of their moderators to work remotely. They don't have enough people recruited into teams internally to really deal with this. So I think sort of for them, it's really a perfect storm which has arrived way too soon. I think that they felt that they were set up to do a much better job on the election, but they didn't see this as a complicating factor. There's a great disinformation researcher, Renee DeResta, who has always said, whatever we think the next threat is going to, she calls it fighting the last war, whatever we think the next threat is going to be, it's not going to be the next threat. You have to look at things in a very flexible fashion. And I think the platforms saw 2020 as presenting them with a set of identifiable challenges, and they were no longer selling advertising in rubles and things like that, but they hadn't anticipated what this would actually do, what something like a pandemic, how that would affect the politics
so I have a couple questions on that front, Emily. One is, I think everybody is now saying, well, gee, if the tech companies can suppress or downrank or address this problem, why didn't they do it earlier? Why didn't they look at politics? So one question I have for you is this now a wake-up call for Facebook do you think that this will dramatically cause them to start thinking about the power of information? And are they now saying, oh my God, people can die? You know, here, there's a couple of people saying, well, gee, if Bolsonaro says don't wear masks, why shouldn't we report it? And the answer is because people can die. So do you think at Facebook now, have you been talking to them, or are they more sort of cognizant of the power of what they do? And
Yes,
will they change their habits, I guess, their practices?
So some of the people I've been talking to sort of officially and unofficially at Facebook say what coronavirus has really done is change the temperature of that conversation within the company. And the idea that the sort of ideological arguments within the company about do we get involved in this or do we stand back from it, which really dominated their attitude towards politics. Mark Zuckerberg was very keen to be even-handed with the left and the right in terms of how they treated news sources, largely I think with an eye, I mean, it was dressed up in sort of terms of free speech and, you know, kind of all those things, but actually it was really a sort of pragmatic move about his own sort of position in terms of potential regulation. Those conversations have been totally sort of like swept aside. Don't forget, you know, the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, which Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan run, are public health initiatives. And so, you know, he thinks he has more expertise in this area. And, you know, the first thing he did, as I say, sort of a couple of weeks ago when Dr. Fauci did not appear at the White House press briefing, was interview him on Facebook Live himself, which is, you know, a very sort of direct journalistic intervention. Should Facebook have woken up to this earlier? I think Facebook is perfectly alive to all of these issues, but it's also, you know, a very successful company. You don't have campaigns like Donald Trump's campaign or Boris Johnson's campaign in the UK using you as a main vector of advertising expenditure and then immediately sort of cut that off. It's just sort of not pragmatic. I think that this, you know, this is a wake-up call, if you like, to everybody. I think this is a wake-up call, not just to Facebook, which has been grappling with these issues for some time. It's also a wake-up call in a way to sort of mainstream journalism as well, because we're not really in control of this. You know, we haven't been in control of it for some time, but really now we are, even though people are paying a great deal of attention to mainstream news, the control of that and how we consume it has pretty much switched, you know, in the last 10 years, it's pretty much switched to the Facebooks and the Googles of this world. And the fact that those are now the players who people want to hear from in terms of what do we do about the advertiser, you know, what do we do about advertising? What do we do about misinformation? Even what do we do about sort of keeping local papers alive? Increasingly, those issues are being landed at the sort of the feet of the platforms. They've resisted it for as long as they can, but I don't think they can resist it any longer. And what will be really interesting is whether or not they continue along this path once the pandemic has sort of subsided somewhat, and once we're back into, you know, the post-coronavirus world. My guess is that they will continue on this path.
So I have a question for you, actually. So we've been talking in my class about this sort of paradox that you're talking about, which is everybody is now relying on the traditional media for responsible and, you know, accurate coverage. At the same time, whatever it is, I think Tower Center has been tracking something like 30,000 jobs have been lost in journalism since, you know, in the last couple months. So what I'm wondering, I was saying to my students, you know, when this is over, when the dust settles, will this be good for science and journalists? Will the world realize, you know, quality information actually matters? You know, we do need a BBC, we do need New York Times. And what my students said to me was no, that because the science is so unsettled and the messages have been so confusing, people will trust journalists left. And we even have somebody in the audience who keeps sending in the little chat things about how terrible the New York Times is and how terrible WHO is. So I'm just wondering, sort of, when the dust settles, what will be the result? You know, what will we have seen here? I mean,
well, I mean, that's, you know, that's so that I think is really interesting, because I just have this little run of slides which will please the person in the chat that says
Yeah.
none of these institutions are to be trusted, because, you know, kind of some of the main perpetrators of the really dangerous information, which is, you know, stuff which is wrong and means that we don't behave in the way we should do as quickly as we should do. You know, World Health Organization, January the 14th, tweets out no clear evidence of human to human transition. Trump asked at Davos what's going on. He says totally trust China on this, and we have it totally under control. Of course, no reason to believe that. The Washington Post, sorry it's not New York Times, but hey, you know, this is an opinion column that they ran on the 1st of February, saying the flu is a much bigger threat than coronavirus for now. This is not, as far as I know, amended or taken down or corrected in any way in their archive. And even this, which is, you know, sort of de Blasio, as recently as March the 10th, saying go out, enjoy yourselves, don't let coronavirus stop you from getting out on the streets of New York. And you have that fusion here of mainstream media, political figures, things which are nothing to do with what we think of as this sort of corrupted world of bad actors and bad information, getting things wrong. And your question is a great one, which is, oh, we've heard so many bad things from mainstream media. We've heard so many things that, you know, that are not true, that nobody will trust them again. I mean, that's very worrying if true, because actually, again, if you look at Pew Center figures on this, the majority of people actually think that the press has done not a bad job. And again, if you look out, I look outside my window here, we're not actually living in a police state. There aren't really many laws, but there's nobody in the park opposite. There are very few people out on the streets. People have, generally speaking, responded to the messages that they've had from Cuomo, that they've read in the papers. If you want to know what's going on in your local hospital, you know, that tends to have come through local media or the New York Times or ProPublica, you know, the Guardian, whatever. And so I think it's very easy to jump to this conclusion of just because the platforms control all revenue on the advertising side, which they do, that there is no place for serious journalism. I just think if you remove what we, you know, everything that we know and all of that litigation of the unsettled does come through expertise and high quality reporting and experts engaging with that. And I think the bigger question for me is really, how can we sort of get away from just talking about misinformation and start to talk about the bigger problems, which are, how do we create a society which is more equitable so people can have an idea of what shared values are? You know, are we looking at platforms to lead creating a world where we have shared values and where civic considerations take on more significance than commercial considerations? Because those are sort of some of the things that we really have to fix. And playing whack-a-mole with misinformation is a short-term tactic, but it can't really be a long-term strategy, either to improve the reporting that we do have when we really need it. And you know, the other point is, we're going to find out what it's like to lose a lot of journalism. We've already found out what it's like to lose a lot of journalism in local areas. What will be fascinating over the next 6 months is, you know, I have students at the moment who are scattered to the four winds in different states in the US, who are noting that in places like West Virginia, where you've actually lost an awful lot of really high quality reporting in the last couple of years because of financial cuts to the press, you do have governors who are not really accountable at all. And I think, you know, that this is, so when we're only thinking about misinformation, I think one of the things that framing has done as a really sort of big disservice around is it hasn't made us think about what are the positives of this, or what it's like to have a world where it's acceptable not to know, or it can be acceptable to make mistakes if you correct them, or where everything isn't a hyper-partisan issue. And those are very long-term problems which can't be solved by tracking, a URL or an identifier on a website. They can't really be dealt with just by debunking some stories. Those are much, much more systemic questions. And I think that, hopefully when everyone goes, what can we do? What can we do? One thing we can do is start to think about, how do we want information education, our communities to be better, and what do we need to do to get there? And that will not just be about what is on Facebook. It should affect what is on Facebook, but it's certainly, I think that that's where the narrowness of the focus on what we think about as misinformation and how we treat it has actually become a real problem, rather than a sort of something that we're necessarily making progress on, if that makes sense.
Emily, as you know, we've talked a lot about what I'm writing at the moment on the different solutions for the problem, and how I sort of simplistically divide them into supply side and demand side. So a whole lot of solutions are really aimed at educating audiences and community engagement. I was on a wonderful call with Andrea Wenzel recently, who I think works with you, about all of the efforts around the country to go into communities and to find out from people, what is it that you want to know and how can we help you? And people want to know which hospitals to go to, or practices. So I would say, when I think about my sort of taxonomy of solutions, you've got media literacy, community engagement efforts, you've got fact-checking efforts, which are all about helping audiences. And sometimes, I'm looking at the chat, sometimes it's complicated. Sure, the WHO thought one thing in January, we have more information now, they think another thing. That is the world, unfortunately. And people with simple answers are often not necessarily reliable. And then we have all of these supply side questions, right? So countries like Germany or China are trying to fix this problem by closing down supply of false information. And you can do that in a bunch of ways. And then finally, I think we have what you're talking about, which is also the provisioning question, which is, can we put good information out there to sort of counteract some of the problems? I'm really happy. I saw somebody in the chat talking about journalists being in the power of big tech. I'm really happy because Emily and I actually have a new book out on this, coming out in September, which is about media capture. So anybody who's interested in learning more about the relationship between journalists and tech companies, email me or Emily, and we'll send you more than you can ever imagine wanting to read. And there's a lot of questions also coming in about trust and the role of the drug companies, the future of information sharing. But I think that Amira has been gathering everything and has a couple of questions all prepared. So I'm hoping that Amira will be able to come in and tell us some questions for you to answer.
Yeah, we do have a lot of questions, so I'm hoping we can maybe answer some of them a little bit quicker,
Yes.
so we can get through many of them. So I'm just going to start by reading some of the ones here. There's a lot of questions on, how will this change information over time with an individual response to COVID? And there's an angle here that's being asked quite often in the chat and Q&A, is how does this affect trust and the information specifically for marginalized groups, as we're seeing sort of these inequity conversations come up in New York specifically?
Right. I think that's a great question, and it is a real problem for established media, and it's a huge problem for platforms as well, which is, as you say, kind of a lack of diversity in media, a lack of coverage in these communities. We did a study on New York local media, which came out in January. One of the big deficits in coverage there was metropolitan hospitals, but we also found that a lot of ethnic media outlets, for instance, have been left out of schemes like the Facebook Journalism Project that supports journalism. We're pleased that the net positive of some of that work is that in the latest round of grants, some of those organisations are now included. But I think we're all at fault for not really, and this is where the work of people like Andrea Wenzel, who studies this, is so important, which is, we haven't asked that fundamental question about what is the role that those various institutions play in building trust in different communities. So many disaffected communities are used to having journalism done to them. You know, they are the most vulnerable when it comes to being exposed to, you know, misinformation, as we saw in the disinformation, as we saw in the 2016 election, because we just simply haven't had well-resourced alternative, you know, institutions built on trust that really come from those communities, that include their views. You know, their views are not included in the way that platforms are designed. They haven't been included in the way that news organizations have designed their own coverage. And I really hope that one of the things that changes is that we find a way of funding these types of institutions which allow us to have real presence, meaningful presence, sustainable careers in those communities, from those communities, and for those communities. Because at the moment, you won't get that from the current commercial environment. So I think it's if you don't have diversity right at the top of your list as a key problem that has to be solved, then I think you're never going to solve any of it. It's a little bit like local. I mean, local is also a sort of a, you know, that copies for community, for diversity as well. It's just that lack of representation at the ground level has created problems right the way up the supply chain, and shows up in sort of democratic failure as well.
Here, here. I'm going to move on to another. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
no, I was going to say, Amira, I know you've got so many.
I'm going to try to get as many of them in because they're great questions.
They really are wonderful.
Quickly move to the next one, which says a lot of the information regarding the pandemic is directly related to data. So given the rise of nationalism sentiments and widening mistrust amongst international communities, do you think this makes the sharing of data more difficult in the future? Someone even mentioned particularly because we have a lot of elections coming up. And do you think there are feasible solutions in this?
It's an interesting one. I think there's a very live debate about this at the moment. You know, data should make our decision making better. It should make our journalism stronger, but it's still dealt with sometimes on a very unsophisticated level by the people who are publishing it. And there are occasional exceptions to that. I mean, anyone who's seen John Byrne Murdoch's charts in the FT of these flattening curves, etc., there's an amazingly rich conversation under those every day about why you're using a log scale, and he really engages with that. But that's a tiny elite conversation. And this idea of I think, you know, kind of when we're talking about media literacy, you know, you need to talk about data literacy as part of that as well. Because, you know, one of the things we've done at Columbia Journalism School is really sort of refashioned the school to include literacy on computation and data, which touches sort of everybody who comes through it and grows that specialization. It's not the answer to everything, because, you know, where does the data come from? Who created it? You know, how was it collated? All of those are going to affect the output in exactly the same way as interviewing one set of people for a story, but not interviewing another set of people for a story. So it's a complicated question, but should we be using more or less data? I think, you know, like everything else, we have to get better at using, you know, the abundance of data that we are sort of currently have, and that we should have, and that we're going to have. I don't think it's a problem of too much of it. I think we have too little of it. And I think our understanding of it and how it can be represented or misrepresented is still relatively poor. And that's a problem that has to be solved at school, within news organizations, at government level, you know, kind of everywhere. I don't think that is just a sort of a binary fix.
Great. And there's a lot of questions specifically on political leaders and leaders in general, and how we're able to trust them, and they're disseminating potentially false information. There's a couple questions here on, you know, we're very concerned that President of the United States might be disseminating false information, like your tweet showed, and others. But also what happens when tech companies potentially censor these individuals like political leaders, and it only furthers that fear and sentiment. So we're kind of in this mixed phase of, do they get censored or do they not, and what are the implications either which way?
I think I think it's a very complicated problem. Hopefully Anya has a better sort of answer to it than I do. I'm a journalist, so I don't trust anybody in power. Inherently, you're always there to ask questions about them, but that you know, I think we've had this very interesting sort of phase where, again, journalism hasn't really caught up with the shift in power and the way that people receive all types of different sort of, you know, kind of messages. So this idea of access journalism, and do you note what the president has said in a press conference, even when it's completely untrue, is a really difficult question for journalists, because on the one hand, you should be calling out the untruths or the provable falsehoods as often as you can. On the other hand, if you don't include them in the public record at all, then you breed that distrust and a narrative that says, you know, this is kind of, and also you don't have a record of what's happened. What happens now when governments change their minds or they change administrations is they wipe the digital records of what happened before. So actually kind of like creating archives and reliable accounts of what happened, we think, well, everything is recorded. How could that possibly be a problem? I think it is a problem. So in terms of how,
I think I would say, Emily, there's a middle ground
yes.
between, you know, quote unquote censorship and amplification, right? So there's lots of ways. One of the things journalists can do is sort of flag when things are incorrect, or when, you know, when the president says something that's not backed up by science, it's totally legitimate to point that out, I think.
Right. I think again, we can get sort of swept up in you know, the sort of misinformation, the industrial complex here. You know, that actually kind of people have, I think, got more insight into what the government is saying and why it might not be right, you know, why it might be wrong, than we've had at any point sort of in the past. So I think that people are very sort of hyper aware of this. I think what's troubling is just the nature of leadership that we have now, and the fact that you can be elected, you can be an elected official simply by telling a whole raft of lies, and nothing holds you accountable, and it doesn't seem to dent your popularity ratings at all. And that's something that we've experienced, you know, right across the world over the past decade or so. And that, I think, is again, you know, a much bigger problem than what do we do about, you know, something which is wrong on Facebook. You know, that's a symptom, if you like, of that world, and all of these things are interconnected. But how do we report these? How do we make sure, I mean, my big worry at the moment is how do we make sure that we do have good reporting and a robust press corps that has the space to get better and not make the same mistakes, but is also sort of resilient to things like personal attacks, doxing, threats from extremist groups. And I'm not talking about places that we traditionally associate with press problems with press freedom. I'm talking about America. You know, we have to prepare our students to be attacked in ways, you know, just reporting the local school board in ways that we would never have imagined before. So I think that sort of this is a multifaceted problem that really we're talking about one small element of it today. And as I say, my worry is really about having the right, what Ethan Zuckerman would call counterbalancing, sort of counter-democratic institutions like the press that actually function, whether it looks like the press or sort of behaves like it used to, you know, is up for debate. But I think you have to have those accountability mechanisms. And at the moment, I think that this threat of, you know, why should we even have journalists? What are they even doing? Is a narrative which actually suits business. It suits the platforms to question the validity of journalism. It suits politicians to question the validity of journalism. And, you know, kind of, I really do think that we have a fight on our hands.
So we're just about at time, but I'd love like a final sentence from you on opportunities for journalists now or after COVID-19, and any sort of advice you have there. We're seeing a lot of talk about journalists in the questions.
So I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think it's just underlining how incredibly important it is to have journalists and good journalists who can interpret expertise, who can hold power to account. I think that, you know, this is a sort of a policy question that Anya and I talk about a lot, which is we really need a way of systemically keeping journalism alive, particularly at local level. I'm not worried about the New York Times. I'm not worried about the Washington. I'm particularly not worried about the Washington Post because it's owned by Jeff Bezos at the moment. But I am worried about all sorts of communities just going underreported or unreported. And I think that, you know, kind of people want to be journalists. When the students come into Columbia, they are incredibly smart, mission-driven people who really want to do good and who are absolutely capable of doing good. Whether or not we can actually keep enough sort of, you know, if we can keep enough resilience, it's a really tough profession at the moment. It's, you know, the pay is dropping, the jobs are being cut. You're losing the sort of camaraderie of the newsroom because there are, you know, there used to be 100 of you, now there are only 4 or 5. And it's actually sort of quite dangerous. And I think if, you know, my hope for anything is we can actually sort of get the attention of, you know, the rich and the powerful, and maybe, you know, when there is a new administration, whenever that may be, we can have this as a very important policy item, because a lot of these changes will have to be rooted, I think, in policy and law, because we don't think the market is going to fix them. I would love to think that sort of Facebook and Google and Twitter and everybody else would play a transformative and philanthropic sort of role in making sure that journalism was safe forever, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to take law to make that the case. I don't know, Anya, what do you think?
I think it's actually exciting right now how big we're all thinking in the journalism community. I think it's been such a worrying problem, the demise of local news, that people are thinking big. So Free Press, James Dean, Victor Pickard, our classes at SEPA, we're all now working on a lot of these initiatives. And I think that that's what we have to do. We have to think really big, and we have to, there's a role for everybody to play here. So I would welcome, you know, it's just fantastic to see all of our alumni and people from the journalism school and people from the community here. And so I think we will absolutely have to continue this conversation. I really hope we'll have our Women in Social Media conference in December 10th and 11th. And if we do, you're all invited. And if not, let's keep talking about disinformation and media capture. And I know that Tao Center will keep publishing. So I just want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Emily Bell for her time. And I especially, again, want to thank Nadine El-Tanamli and Amira Dalla for their superb work getting this all together. And, you know, thanks to SEPA. At times like this, it's so good to be part of our Columbia community and to just see each other and the names and the faces. So thank you all. And we'll continue this, I guess, by email or on Twitter. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.